Good morning to our SILGA membership out in Zoomland out there. We want to welcome to the first of three presentations for the SILGA Fall Speaker Series. My name is Robin Smith, and I'm the mayor for the District of Logan Lake. I'm also a director on the SILGA board, and I'd like to acknowledge that today we are presenting this to you, and it's produced while we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Tk'emlúps and Shuswet'en people. The first speaker that we have with us today is Miss Christina Benty. Christina is a speaker, author, and recovering self-described overthinker. As a former mayor for the town of Golden, her leadership journey forced her to face her own resistance to uncertainty and discomfort. She uses her lived experiences to help expose the stories that keep local government teams trapped in power dynamics, hierarchies, and competitive us and them thinking. She's the owner of Strategic Leadership Solutions, a consulting firm designed to assist teams in building a culture of excellence and leadership in governance. Christina has worked across the country informing, educating, and engaging local governments on sustainable service delivery challenges and opportunities. She focuses on the importance of building a common language and understanding that allows local governments to address the complex issues in a collaborative manner. Take it away, Christina.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mayor Smith, for the introduction. And you always forget which bio you send in ages ago. And so as I was listening to that, I was chuckling to myself because we are going to be talking today about something that has many local governments uncomfortable. And one of the things that you said was that facing my own resistance to uncomfortable conversations was one of my big learnings as elected official. So I will continue to share that with you. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And for those of you who don't know me, I have been working with Asset Management BC and UBCM to deliver these Asset Management 101 workshops across the province. So some of you may have attended those. I can't see any of you, so I have no idea who's in attendance today, but some of you may have attended those conversations. And so I'm looking forward to your questions. And so what I want to do is invite you to bring your intellectual curiosity into this conversation and into the room with you right now. So my overall intention is to demystify and decontaminate asset management and reframe it as instead of being a thing or a project or a plan, to reframe it as a lens, a way of doing business, a philosophical lens through which you should be making your decisions through. And I've been working across the country trying to get elected officials and staff and of course communities, citizens to care. And ideally, I would love this to be conversational. However, because it's not, there's going to be an opportunity for you to ask some questions later. And so I hope you will. I invite you to ask some questions. Here's what I really want you to take away. If I think about what is the thing that I most want you to take away from this short, high-level Asset Management 101 presentation, is that the asset management process, the asset management way of thinking, helps you to be a good ancestor, right? Someday you are going to be a former decision maker. Someday you are going to be the ancestor that made decisions. And asset management helps you be one of those decision makers that the future is going to bless, right? And say, oh, thank you for doing that. So it's all about being a good ancestor. Because asset management, we're all asset managers, right? In our personal lives, we all have assets that provide services. You might have a house or a car or a boat or a vacuum cleaner, a coffee maker. all of these different assets. And as if you're the adult in the house, then you are both a user and you are also the you have a stewardship responsibility over those assets. So in other words, if you go out and buy an asset, a $50,000 truck, probably that's a little, maybe more like a $70,000 truck, and you can't actually feed your family, then that's poor stewardship and poor asset managing, right? If those are the kind of decisions that you make. In elected office, it's actually the principles are no different, right? When it comes to governance. So as an elected official, you are a user of assets and services that are provided in your community, but you also have that stewardship responsibility over those assets. So most of you provide services that require a number of assets, and every community provides different services. So you've probably got parks and trails, and you've got recreational facilities and fire services, water and sewer, just to name a few, right? And so if you build it, then you have a obligation to look after it and then replace it for future generations. It's important to remember that it really is, asset management is basic common sense principles. And so what's gotten in the way? Well, a couple things: time and age. So it was built a long time ago, so we forget about it. We don't think about it, right? And we don't think about things until they break down or start to wear out, right? Standards of change, the legislative environment, those standards have changed, and so it impacts when we go to replace an asset, that you can't replace it with the same standard that you built that asset in the first place. There's also safety requirements that have changed and engineering standards that have changed. So that adds additional complexity and cost to your assets. Also, expectations from the community have changed, and they are constantly changing, right? A short period of time ago, it wasn't that long ago that local governments actually provide a narrow focus of localized services. Now they provide a broad range of services, and those services are getting more complex. People have higher demands. So it's kind of the perfect storm. And because collectively, and this is a co-created reality, it's a co-created between residents, between the local government, and elected officials. So staff, elected officials, and residents, and businesses. We've overbuilt our environment. Maybe not, but we've overbuilt it and we've underplanned. Because I know very few local governments that are replacing their assets at the rate that they're wearing out. So this perfect storm, all this aging infrastructure, new standards, and growing expectation, this has fallen on you as elected officials. This has fallen on you. And so you have this stewardship responsibility to turn the tide of underinvestment and short-term thinking, and use asset management as a decision-making lens through which you make all your decisions. So that's my introduction to my presentation. So I'm going to bring up my slide presentation from FCM that I have embellished. So just give me a moment here while I bring that up. As I indicated before, this program is funded through Asset Management BC and UBCM, and through FCM. So before COVID, I was traveling across the country, extolling the virtues of asset management. And I was up in the Northwest Territory speaking at a conference, and somebody came up to me and they said, they had read some articles and they'd see me talk on videos and stuff. And they said, oh, you're kind of a big deal in the asset management world. And I made a joke. I said, you know what, thank you. I appreciate that. But I said, it's a little bit like being a big fish in a mud puddle, right? Because nobody seems to care as much as I do. And so I have made it my mission to care and to and to have these conversations, not only around the province, but around the country. Because like I said, if we've built all these assets and we have all this built environment, then we have an obligation to future generations to look after it. So if you were in the room, I would be asking about what you're curious about. So I invite you to write down some of those questions and think about what you're curious about, but also what keeps you up at night when it comes to service sustainability. And it's more than that. It's about what are the conversations that you should be having. If you are not replacing your assets at the rate that they're wearing out, then it's very possible that are you having the right conversations with your staff and with council and with the community? And so again, this short presentation is about building a corporate culture of asset management, that the right conversations are being had. So I want to dig into what is asset management. It's kind of got a bad rap. The word management, it's like, oh, that must be staff's job because it's about management, right? And we're governors, but you have a significant role. So we're going to come back to, I just want to quickly talk about the context and remind everyone why they're here, and remind everyone why local government exists. Because most of the time government gets a bad rap, and when people complain to me about the government, I'll often say, well, how you hate the government? Well, do you hate water, and do you hate roads, and do you hate recreation facilities? And when you put it that way, folks then start to realize that, oh yeah, government is actually designed, and particularly local government, to be a service provider, right? To provide those safe, sustainable, secure services in a predictable and cost-effective manner. So in other words, I want to show up at my library and I want to have it open the hours that it says it's going to be open. I want to put my garbage out at the end of the driveway and have it disappear. I want to be able to drive on roads that are relatively safe and free of potholes and looked swept and looked after. So there's an expectation that all of these services are going to be provided. And staff deliver the services, right? Elected officials don't deliver the service. So it begs the question then, why do we actually need elected officials in the first place then? And if we were in the room, I'd have that conversation with you. And it's really about stewardship and governance over the organization that provides those services. So when you think about what was I actually elected to do, you were actually elected to do nothing. You were elected to think. And I want to propose two questions that I think that I want you to encourage you to think about. And I guarantee that as you think about them, they will take up your entire time as an elected official. So here are the two key questions that you need to think about. Number one, what services does our community want and need now and into the future, and at what level? That's not actually staff's job to decide. That is the job of elected officials. Staff deliver the services, but the elected officials determine and have always determined what are the services that our community wants and needs, and at what level. Some levels are technical and you don't get to decide, those are legislative, but most of your levels of service, elected officials have a huge role in. So that is the first question, and that should be part of your orientation. Here are the services we provide, and here's the level that we provide these services at. And then the second question really is around what are the services our community is willing and able to pay for. And I would hazard a guess that this question has been poorly contemplated, because the reality is, when you look at these two key questions that are your roles and responsibilities, your job to think about as elected officials, one of the reasons that the money question hasn't thoroughly been investigated, what are we willing and able to pay for, is that a third of our infrastructure right across this country is in poor condition. So I want to show you this photo here. This is a picture from Montreal, and it's 2013, so really not that long ago, but it might seem like a long time ago. What's important about this photo here is that the elected officials had been warned for years about their underinvestment in their linear assets. They had been warned for years. They were supposed to be spending $200 million a year, and they were spending $8 million a year. So that is a huge gap in terms of funding investment. But here's the kicker. When the underinvestment accelerated to this level, in order to bring their infrastructure back up into working order, they had to start spending $600 million a year. So that's $400 million a year more than if they had invested on a regular basis in their existing infrastructure. So this photo tells a story of underinvestment, and many of our communities are not in that bad a shape, but you might be surprised. Some of the staff that I talk to, for example, one of their concerns that they often have, particularly are their sewer systems. And that their sewer systems were built, 50, 70 years ago. And with ongoing rain events, right? With ongoing climate change and weather events are impacting the sewer system. There's a lack of funds available to replace those underground assets. And what we're seeing in some communities across the province is customers' basements are flooding, right? And so this underinvestment, particularly when you're growing as a community and your existing infrastructure is in poor condition, then it may not be able to handle the level of development that's required in your community. And because the question, when we're talking about budgets, we often talk about budgets in terms of, what can we afford to, what is the tolerable tax increase? But we don't talk about what's the impact, what's the risk and the consequences to services and service levels. Then we're having the wrong conversation. And this picture is really key. So how did we get here? Well, we built a lot of assets and we didn't take full life cycle costing into consideration. Operations and maintenance and replacement costs are approximately 70 to 80% of the cost of new assets. I know when I was elected in 2002, there was no funding for existing assets, right? So we kept building, there was lots of granting opportunities and we kept building more and more and more assets, but we never took into consideration what it was going to cost to maintain those assets. And so that short-term thinking, which you can't afford to do anymore, has led us to this place. Also, being reactive rather than proactive. A story that I love to share is that I was doing some strategic planning in this community, and I asked the public works manager, how much time do you spend on reactive maintenance versus proactive maintenance? And he looked at me, he goes, about 85% reactive. And the council gasped. And I turned to the council and I said, that is a conversation you need to have with your staff. Don't avoid that conversation. How much time are you spending on reactive maintenance versus proactive maintenance? So it's important to know, because being proactive, it costs you money in the short term, but will save you money in the long term, as you can see. And of course, because we have failed to link services to the cost to provide those services, and we've forgotten about the assets that provide service, we've kind of been pretending that there's no cost to provide those services. Water's not free, trails aren't free, garbage pickup, emergency services, all of those things. None of those things are free. So one of the other key questions that you have to ask yourself is, are we spending too much or too little on the infrastructure that provides those services? And that's a conversation that you are obligated as a good ancestor to have with your staff. What should we be spending? And that's what should have happened in Montreal. What should we be spending and what are we spending? And what are we going to do about that gap? Because if you are going to provide services, then you need to manage your assets. All right, so I want to dig into asset management. Hopefully you're not looking like this. I can't see you. I'm just staring at my screen. So I'm hoping you're not looking like that right now. So asset management really it's a formalized way of managing your assets. And I think what's important about this sentence here is it's a reminder that those services, even if people aren't paying attention to them, those services are the services that contribute to people's quality of life. They use them every single day. People want water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They certainly don't want water for 6 days a week and 12 hours a day. They want it 24 hours a day, right? So it's not something people think about, but all of those assets and services contribute to people's quality of life. So asset management really is starting off by having a conversation around what services does our local government provide, and getting really clear, and then actually asking the question, why do we even provide those services? Because often asset management starts with the question, oh, what assets do we own? It's more than that. It's why do we provide those services? Because I've worked in communities where they own assets that don't provide services. I was working up in the Yukon in a small community that had a helicopter and a helicopter pad, but it wasn't used. Nobody could fly the helicopter. No, there was no helicopter engineer. So they had this asset and it didn't provide the service. So the first question is, what are the services that we provide and why do we provide that service? And then of course you get into the questions about what are the assets we own that provide those services? So one of the questions you might want to ask your staff is, do we have an inventory of all of our assets that provide services? So it really isn't just about the assets, it's about the service that it provides. So every community provides different services. And I just listed some of the services that my community provides. When I was out I was raw. When I was mayor, I was out bragging to our community about all the services that we provided, including things like FOI requests, right? Grant writing services, land use planning, signage, all these different services. So getting in the habit of listing all of your services is really, really helpful. So what services do you provide and why? What assets do you own and where are they, right? The asset, that's your asset registry. And then condition assessments. What condition are they in and what is the expected remaining life? So how much life does this have? How much life does this roof have on our arena or our community center? How much life is left in these roads, in our sewer pipes, our water pipes? So defining, where are you at with your condition assessments? Asking staff, have we done condition assessments on all our critical assets that provide our key services like water and sewer? Do we have condition assessments done on those? Where are we at with condition assessments on our facilities, on our buildings, on our fleet? And it's not about, and I think this is really important, it is not about blame or shame. Oh, I can't believe that past council or those staff. Like it's a waste of time to point fingers. And it's really important to go, okay, where are we at now and how do we move forward in a responsible, sustainable manner, right? Also identifying what's the current level of service that an asset provides and what's the desired level of service. As people's expectations are changing, I went and played pickleball for the first time the other day, and there's quite a crew of pickleballers there. And so our assets may have been providing different services than they did 20 years ago or 10 years ago, right? So what is the desired level of service? And are you maximizing those assets? And when folks do things like, and oftentimes you will hear things like, well, we used to run this town with 10 people and now look at all the staff you've got. And it's important to be able to articulate to the public, listen, we used to manage this number of assets and provide this number of services, and now we manage these many assets and this number of services. So as elected officials, you have a moral obligation to articulate that to the public when they're asking questions, right? So it's not only our built asset and inventory, identifying what our built assets are, it's also about what's our natural assets. Do you know what your natural assets are? And do you know how they serve your built assets and serve your community? As you can see here from this slide, a number of our green assets, our natural assets, provide a very important service to our community. And you can actually reduce your costs when you maximize those natural assets. And of course, people that goes without saying, you might have assets, but if you don't have people that deliver services, if you don't value those human assets, you've got nothing. Your community has nothing. And so recognizing that people are a key asset in your community. So another component of asset management is risk assessment, right? So part of staff's job, just by nature, their job is to be risk averse. And your job as elected officials is to have a good understanding of what are the risks and what are the consequences. What is the risk to underinvesting in our sewage treatment plant, or underinvesting in our road infrastructure, underinvesting in our pipes, our storm drain management system? What is the consequence to that? And what's the risk? So there's social risks, there's health and safety risks, but there's also political risks. What's the risk in your community if you don't have a plan or a strategy to look after the assets that you already have? So risk assessment, and then of course the risk of climate change. I've talked a little bit about that, but I think it's really interesting too. When we had the heat dome down in Vancouver, sidewalks buckled. Like, who would have thought that had never happened before? Or maybe it had. I'd never heard of it. But having these climate events at an increasing rate are impacting our assets and impacting our ability to provide service. So now you must take climate change into consideration when you're replacing your assets. So the other key to asset management is having a long-term financial plan. And this is more than having a discussion about, okay, what's the tolerable tax rate that we can manage? No, it is about having a conversation around what's the service that we provide. What is the level that we provide that service? And what does it cost to provide that level? And then the conversation from there, once you've defined that, the conversation from there can go, what should we be spending? And should we be increasing our levels of service, maintaining our levels of service, decreasing, eliminating? Is there services or assets that could be retired? That's a brave conversation that needs to be had. Right. So again, this is asset management is from my perspective is there's nothing in your job that is not connected to this line of thinking, to asset management. So that's why I want you to think about it as a philosophical lens through which you make your decision. And so here's one of my favorite definitions. It's about decision-making, and decision-making for the future and for current needs. What are the risks and opportunities, and how do we use our resources wisely? So it gives you information to plan for tomorrow. So one of the challenges that you will face as an elected official is really identifying what services does our community need, and what do we really need, right? And are there services that we're prepared to do without if we can't afford them? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Maybe you can't afford not to provide the service. What are the risks then that you're willing to accept? And what are you willing to pay for? And then the thing about asset management, supporting your staff in their developing their cognizance and supporting their data collection, allows you to participate in the conversation with your community around services and service level and cost to provide. All right, so if we were in the same room, I'd be asking you about how you've incorporated asset management into your practices, but we shall move along. All right, so I talked a little bit about financial planning and long-term financial planning. So getting some clarity on things like, what are our revenue streams? Do you have a cost recovery strategy? I know oftentimes we would get complaints from folks about fees and charges in our recreation facilities, but I would take the time to explain to people that actually, if you were paying the true cost to provide that service, you would be paying every time you went to the pool, it'd be $300 drop in. Skating fees would be 10 times more than they are. So really identifying, do we have a cost recovery strategy? Who benefits, right? Who benefits, who pays? And it's part of your job as an elected official. And then this last question is a real kicker. If we don't get more money, what is going to be the risk, the impact to our service level, and the risk consequences? So lots of questions to dig into as an elected official that will keep you busy for a long time. And of course, service levels, that's really key. A key role, right, is identifying what are the levels of service that we provide, making sure that's embedded into policy and that staff have the resources to provide the level of service that you have defined through your bylaws and your policies, right? And is it sustainable? And is the public willing to pay, right? We may want to drive on heated streets where the snow just disappears and they look pristine, and we may not be able to afford that, right? So defining your current levels of service and determining if they are if they're achievable in the long term, given your current level of funding. Sure wasn't in Montreal, right? So also identifying, are you reactive or proactive? And one of the questions, particularly early on in your term as an elected official, where do you want to be in the next 5 years? And what is it going to take to get there in terms of being reactive or proactive? So staff's job is fearless advice, right? Their job is to provide you with fearless advice and to deliver those services. So their job, expert advice, facts and data. Their job is to outline those consequences and risks to meet those legislative and the levels of services that you've set. And then your job is to have really a high level understanding of what are the services we provide, making sure that staff have the appropriate resources to be able to provide the services. And then to be out in the public, representing the public in terms of what do we want, and what do we need, and what are we willing and able to pay for? So a couple action steps before I close off: making sure that you have an asset management policy, and that includes life cycle costing. So anytime you take on a new asset or replace an asset, that you know what the full life cycle costing is. That you engage the public, that you engage with your staff and have meaningful, rich, candid, truthful conversations. Is it safe for staff to tell you the truth? And how do you react to that? Right? So making sure that asset management is a lens, it should be on every staff report. What are the asset management consequences? So keeping it top of mind and using it as an engagement tool for your community, for your conversations, because everything is about asset management. Like I said earlier, you all have assets, and you have an obligation to look after them.
So making sure that your policies maximize the life of your assets and they balance the levels of service with the cost to provide. So really, really key. So this is an important question, and I'm going to just throw it out there because one of the things I said was your job as an elected official is to grapple over what are the services our community wants and needs now and into the future, and what are they willing and able to pay for. And here's the thing, you can't ask people what they're willing and able to pay for if you don't know what it costs. So working with your staff to determine the services and service levels that you have designed for your community and that you've outlined, you need to know what those costs are so that you can enter into a conversation. Because if you ask people will complain about their taxes, but if you tell them that you're going to reduce their services or their service levels, they're not so keen on that, right? So making sure that you're supporting staff to provide you with that data and information. I'm going to quickly jump through the rest of these. Making sure that you're having a public dialogue because we can't actually afford to ignore it. Making sure that you're connecting services and service levels to cost to provide in all your communications. Asset Management BC has tons of resources for you, very, very helpful resources, and we're working at making them more interesting. But it really is, at the end of the day, it's about being a good ancestor, and it's about bravely being willing to share the truth. Hey, guess what? We've underinvested in our existing infrastructure, and now we're paying the price, right? So here's where we're at. I think I have over talked, and so I'm going to stop right now. And I'm so curious to know if anybody's got any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Christina, for your presentation. If there's one thing I do know about Christina, it is her passion for asset management. I've had the opportunity to work with her a number of times on this topic, and it is definitely something she's very, very passionate about. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and I definitely do have some questions for you. Some of them you sort of touched on a little bit, but I wouldn't mind if you could expand a little bit for us. One of the questions that I have is, when dealing with older infrastructure that isn't above ground, are you better off to borrow to keep a management schedule, or are you better off to keep putting the reserves aside and hoping that nothing goes wrong? And that's from Councillor Barb Weeb from Lillooet.
Good question. So I'm actually going to say both and. I think it's really key to remember that you should be building up your reserves, and it's highly likely that your reserves are going to be inadequate when it comes to replacing some of those key significant assets. And so I would say it's a both and. There's a concept called temporal fiscal equivalence. In other words, you get what you pay for when you use it. That's the simplest version. And one of the things that I would say is that oftentimes we'll hear the public say, well, I don't want to pay for the future because I've already paid for the past. And I would actually argue that the past hasn't been fully paid for. Otherwise, we could replace those assets because we haven't taken operations, maintenance, and replacement costs into consideration, and we're not prepared for that. So ensuring that your fees include building up reserves, but also being willing to borrow for the future. So don't be afraid to borrow. It's a philosophical conversation that you're elected, that you get to have around the board table, around the council table.
Thank you very much, Christina. I don't know whether there's any other questions out there, but if there is anybody that does have another question they would like to send in, we can take more questions. I do have another one here. A great question from Tony Aboot, Mayor of Summerland. And her question is, how can the value of ecological natural assets be assessed, and how do we account for their value in asset management?
Oh, good. Yeah, good question. So the Municipal Natural Capital Assets initiative has tons of resources. And of course, many of you are aware that Gibson's BC has done a really good job. And I believe there's a few other communities. North Van, the district of North Van has also done a really good job of identifying their natural capital assets and utilizing them in their asset management strategy. And I think Souk has as well. So check out what they are doing, and you can access resources and support from the Municipal Natural Capital Assets Initiative. They have funding available, and they have many resources available. So check that organization out for those things. They will have tools that you can utilize.
Thank you very much. I also have a question, Christina, with regard to strategies around having discussions about asset management in a way that's going to be engaging and comprehensive, not just for staff, but for the public, because we know that you love it and fully understand it and have a passion for it. But that's a really tough sale in terms of attracting a crowd conversation. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe give us some suggestions in how people might generate that conversation and make space for that.
A couple tools that you can use really are finding metaphors that are relevant. I used to like to use the metaphor of a Mercedes versus a Prius, right? What kind of service levels are we providing, and defining those and using metaphors. So use metaphors in your community that are relevant, and when it comes to describing your levels of service. And but also really breaking down the cost. So one of the things, and this is something that I did, I made a video for the community, and I talked about the fact that this bottle of water costs this much, and you're actually, for every, what you're paying for in your water on a daily basis, you could actually take showers, wash your dishes. So linking those costs to the services that people are receiving, and using really practical ways. Hey, guess what? For a case of beer, you're getting all of this. Asking people things like, how much do you think you spend on communication, like your phones, your internet, your cable, asking people what they pay for those things, and reminding them, actually, you're probably paying more. Ask people what they pay for a year of insurance. I bet they're paying more on their car, house, and life insurance, right? And so just finding those metaphors and finding those linkages that are actually quite simple to be able to do. For a nice dinner out, you get all this. For, like I said, a case of beer, you get all this. But as elected officials, you need to be well versed on the services, and like I said, and the service levels, so that you can engage in that conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. I do have another question. And the question again is from Barb Weeb from Lillooet. And her question is, she'd like to know how to convince the public, and you sort of touched on this already a little bit, that the infrastructure that you don't see, like sewer pipes and water pipes, etc., are actually more important than parks and dog parks, and especially when they've been neglected for so many years.
Yeah. So this is where I think the most important leadership competency that's required in elected officials, local elected officials, is courage and bravery. So the ability to tell the truth and say, I know, I understand that these things are important to you, but we're also looking after your foundational services. How much is water and sewer worth to you? And we can't neglect our core services. We can't neglect our core services and just provide those aesthetic services that the community loves. One of the images that I like to use is a tree image, and the roots of the tree are things like water and sewer, garbage, emergency management, land use planning. So they're the roots, right? And then the trunk, and that's visible. That's our recreational facilities, and the parks and the trails and the things that people love, the skateboard parks and all of those things. Those are the trunk. And then I'll often refer to the branches as those are the things that really make our community pretty, the aesthetics and the side or the signage and the flowers and all the things that make our community really attractive. If you neglect the roots and only look after the leaves, then you are putting at risk your tree, your community. And so those brave, bold conversations use every modality to communicate what people get for what they're paying, and then be willing to have the difficult conversation. And because here's the thing, most people, for the most part, are pretty reasonable. Once you articulate the services and the value of the services, most people are pretty reasonable. They may not like it, but they'll get it, right? This goes back to, you can't, if you go out and buy a $70,000 truck and you can't feed your family, that is irresponsible.
Thank you very much for that question. I don't believe there's any others on coming in from the audience, but I do have one that maybe you could just touch on a little bit. I think that a lot of us have seen with COVID, it sort of highlighted the need for, better technology and internet and service and all that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if the long-term impacts of COVID, like what that's going to look like in the asset management world, and if you want to just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking that question. Here's what I think. That I, as a matter of fact, I'm watching it happen already, that people are receiving actually a lower level of service for a higher cost, right? So sanitation costs are going up, distancing costs, all of the infrastructure that had to be put into place doesn't provide a higher level of service, provides a lower level of service, but it's a higher cost. And again, it takes a lot of courage to articulate that to the public. So providing even the same level of service or even a lower level of service is actually costing us more. And that's the challenge, right now that everyone is facing. I also want to close with this, just because you brought up technology, and we're all having to spend more time on technology and on Zoom, and there's a human cost. And one of the things I think is really important is to remember as elected officials is you're asset managers, but you also have an asset, and that's yourself, your brain, your body, your heart, mind, and soul. And what are you doing for that particular asset? Are you asking it what it needs, right? Maybe it needs a glass of water. Maybe it needs a sleep. Maybe it needs to get off that bloody technology, right? Get off Zoom, give yourself a break, go get some fresh air. So as an asset manager, you have a stewardship responsibility for your own personal asset as well. COVID's taken a toll on all of us in a number of different ways. There's been really good things that have emerged from it, but there's been lots of significant challenges, and we're just starting to feel some of the fallout in our communities, and but it also in our personal lives. So look, asset management is also about looking after yourself and managing that asset.
How much detail is put into the asset management registry?
So one of the things that I would say is that as an elected official, you don't need that level of detail. Staff's job is to provide you with the high level information in terms of the asset registry. So you don't need to see the asset registry, but you need to know that it's being done, right? That your staff have an asset registry, that they have condition assessments done, or they're working towards that. One of the things I think that's really key, particularly for small communities, is that as they build the asset registry, they'll identify some of your newer assets you need less information on, but some of your older assets, so those age-based condition assessments, that's where you identify that, oh yeah, we're going to need more information on this particular asset. So the focus for staff, and again, this is the role of staff, is to really dig into what those age-based condition assessments are telling us, and what do we need to, how do we need to get some conditions assessments done sooner rather than later, so that we can feed that information back to the elected officials. So there's varying degrees to the levels of information that you require, but that is staff's role. And what's key is that you provide staff with the commensurate resources to build an asset management strategy and an ethos in your organization, so that you have that information. And if they don't have the information, your question, what is it going to take for you to get into a position where you can confidently provide this information? One of the things I would also say that's really important is that staff often want to come to elected officials, come to councils and boards with perfect information. They're risk averse by nature. The engineering department, the financial department, they're very linear thinkers. They want perfect information to bring to you. Welcome their best guess. Okay, create an environment where staff can tell you, here's what we do know, and here's what we don't know. Don't crucify them for what they don't know, but build a culture so that you can have conversations that build capacity in the organization, so that staff are able to really use the data that they do have and not provide you with perfect information. We have to create a culture where there's this comes back to the place of discomfort at the beginning when you were doing the intro, is learning to become comfortable, or learning to welcome discomfort and not knowing everything is part of your job as an elected official.
Thank you. I hope you have time for a couple more questions.
Oh, sure.
Oh, good. Okay. Because I have one for you from Cindy Fortin from Peachland. And her question, Christina, is in Peachland, we did a full asset management review and we looked at what we needed in reserves. We were given 5 options that included risks and costs. And as a small community, we couldn't afford to accept the highest investments. Am I saying that right? Investments? Taxes would have been skyrocketed. I'm sorry, I'm reading some writing here, and I think I got that right for you. Could you help Cindy with that question?
So here's, if I understand the question properly, the Audi, the BMW cost was astronomical and your community couldn't afford it, right? And so again, this is part of what you get to do as elected officials, is identify what's the risk that needs to be prioritized and what risk are we willing to assume, and then how do we develop a strategy to put ourselves in a better position. So I'll give you an example. In a community that I worked in, they were the engineering firm that did their condition assessments on their roads told them they needed to be spending $500,000 a year on their roads. And they were spending $100,000 on their roads a year. So, but the conversation that they had is that they needed to move the needle up to $250,000 a year. And the reason that they had that conversation is because again, recognizing that the engineering firms by design, and engineers are by design, are going to give you the they're going to give you the ISO standards, the international standards. They have a high standard in order to reduce risk as much as possible. You may determine in your community, this is the level of risk that they're willing to assume. We're willing to assume. So we can look at usage. We can look at yeah, we're willing to have more potholes rather than just a pristine road all the time. There's no right or easy answer to that. It is a choice that you get to wrestle with. But what you do need to think about is looking at the risk and consequences. What is the risk that we're willing to assume, and how do we develop a strategy to ensure that we're investing at some appropriate level, recognizing that and this is why it's important when you're doing your budgeting conversation that you are able to articulate to the public, we're actually we're in unwittingly reducing our levels of service by underinvesting because we don't feel that the tax rate is tolerable, is going to be tolerable. It's going to be too difficult. Looking at options as well. I mean, obviously granting, making sure, one of the key things, and I forgot to say this, and that is that as you develop your asset management plan, it helps you to access funding, get grant infrastructure funding. You need to demonstrate that you're moving along the maturity continuum when it comes to asset management. So by investing in that, it helps you to access funding. But it really means that you're going to have some of those candid, brave, difficult conversations. If we can't afford everything, then what are we willing to let go of, or what are we willing to do less of, or are we willing to have a lower level of service in certain areas, in certain things? There's no easy answer. It really is the perfect storm, right? Because ideally you would have been building up your reserves years ago.
Thank you. Thank you. I have one last question. The last question that I have is, do open houses and inviting the community to see city facilities, is that helpful?
That's a good question. I think personally, I think it's a great idea. One of my favorite sayings is, when it comes to communication, is no one thing works, but everything works when you work it. So looking for creative ways to engage the public and communicate cost to provide service, I think is really key. And so, yeah, that's a great idea if you can work that out and say, hey, here's come tour the sewage treatment plant, and then but make sure that you're attaching cost to it. Look at all the things that are involved. You could make little videos. There's a lot of creative ways to invite the public. Like I said, it could be videos, it could be animated. Vernon, the city of Vernon did a fantastic job a couple of years ago on their little asset management video that they made. And they didn't say the word asset management. That's what was so beautiful about it. They were talking about, that they had aging infrastructure and they needed to invest in it. And here's what they were doing. And so making those little videos, but using every modality that you can. I think it's a great idea. One of the things, though, I do want to say is, who are you responding to? And every community is different, but sometimes we are overly responsive to the critical minority. And is everybody freaking out in your community about the tax rate and about fees and charges? Is it everybody, or is it a small critical minority? And are you focusing all your attention on easing easing some of the arrows that are thrown your way? Or that again, every community is different. But I found that we had a tendency to be overly responsive to those who were really critical, and most of the residents were just happy. And we used all the communication tools we could, but most people were actually quite happy with the services and service levels, and were willing to pay more for a higher level of service. So.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. We appreciate your wholesome answers. I said I only had one more question, but I actually do have one more, and that's would you mind sending your slide deck for us so that we can share it with the rest of SILGA? And I want to thank those who did take the time to send in questions today, and also to thank Christina. One of the quotes Christina uses that I've seen her use often, and it's a quote by Seth Gordon that's resonated with me. And it said, if you take care of the things that if you take care of the important things, the urgent things don't show up as often. And the opposite is never true. And that I think is a great quote specifically for asset management. So thank you, Christina. And I also want to thank Trans Mountain for sponsoring today's session. And also to remind the membership that we do have a number of other sessions coming up over the next little while. And we would love to see your participation in the speaker series. Our next one is Dan George from the Four Directions Management Services at noon on November the 24th. You definitely don't want to miss that. He's going to be speaking on the best practices for building relationships between local governments and First Nations governments. And remember to pencil in the SILGA AGM and convention in your calendar for April 26th to April 29th. And hopefully you guys can all enjoy some sunshine today. And thank you very, very much. And thank you, Christina, for engaging with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Be a good ancestor, everyone.